Alright, welcome back to Hoop Hierarchy. This is KC. This is going to be the third video in this video series talking about the first overall draft picks throughout NBA history, leading all the way back to the beginning of the NBA, and ranking them by how well they lived up to the hype of being the number one overall pick throughout their NBA career. So, like I've said in the past videos, I'm not going to do a deep dive on these players' play styles. I'm basically just covering their career stats, some notable things about them, ranking them, so on and so forth. But this one right here, this is over the first overall picks from 1971 to 1980. There's some good players in here, there's some bad players in here, and then there's a mix of pretty much everything in between. But yeah, I'm going to get right on into this one. And again, this is over a player's career, not necessarily how well they did with the team that drafted them, just as how well they played throughout their NBA career as a whole, and if they lived up to the hype of being that number one overall player. So yeah, first player in the list is Austin Carr, the number one overall pick in 1971. So Austin Carr was one of the best college players of his era, so definitely no surprise that he went number one overall. During his 3-year career at Notre Dame, he averaged 34.5 points per game and holds multiple NCAA scoring records, like points in an NCAA tournament game with 61. Carr had a really promising start to his NBA career when he got drafted. He averaged over 20 for his first 3 seasons, but he was injured pretty consistently, and during the 1974-75 season, ended up suffering a pretty bad knee injury, to which basically was the nail in the coffin for his star potential. His stats never really returned to pre-injury levels after that. He ended up being on some fun Cavs teams, namely the Miracle of Richfield team is what they were called in the 1975-1976 season, when they made a surprise playoff run and beat the Washington Bullets, who were pretty good at the time. If it wasn't for his injury struggles, Carr could probably have had a better career, but he was still solid in general, and stuck around for a while, so he's going to be B tier for me. So next up is LaRue Martin. So, unlike Austin Carr, he cannot necessarily be classified as solid. As one of the more questionable decisions in draft history, LaRue Martin was certainly not bad in college. He averaged 19.6 and 15.7 as a senior on a pretty not great Loyola Chicago team. But the Trailblazers scout saw him play really well against Bill Walton one game and decided that was enough to be taken number one overall. That and, of course, the Bob McAdoo situation. McAdoo was clearly better than Martin in college, but there were many rumors flying around that McAdoo, namely, had signed with the Virginia Squires of the ABA after a secret ABA draft took place in which names of those drafted players were not made public. Reportedly, NBA Commissioner Walter Kennedy advised teams not to draft McAdoo because of that. Other reports were that a contract was signed and voided because McAdoo was too young to have signed it, and the Buffalo Braves somehow knew this. And then there was another story that said Portland negotiated with McAdoo on the eve of the draft but could not meet his demands. And then later, McAdoo was indeed the number one overall pick of the 1972 ABA draft. So, in general, McAdoo was considered the better player, but there was a lot of questions about the ability to sign him that made the Trailblazers say, we like LaRue Martin enough, we're going to go with him instead anyway. McAdoo ends up getting picked right behind Martin. And the Milwaukee Bucks draft Julius Erving with the number 12 pick, who was playing in the ABA at the time, but still, better player career-wise than LaRue Martin. So Martin ended up being a part of a pretty stacked draft class, obviously, with McAdoo, Dr. J, Paul Westphal. He did not perform. He played 4 seasons and averaged 5 a game for his career, being called by many one of the biggest draft busts in NBA history. It's hard to disagree with that classification. He was not very good in the NBA. And the guys drafted around him just kind of confirmed how rough of a pick it was. So yeah, LaRue Martin is going to be F tier. So next up is Doug Collins, probably more well known as a coach to the younger generations. Doug Collins was a pretty good player in all reality. He played for Illinois State in college and then was selected number one overall by the 76ers. He developed into a really great but often injured secondary piece to Dr. J in Philadelphia. And while they never won a championship with him, he was a really solid piece. His injuries limited him all. But in reality, the only player drafted in his draft that can be said to be clearly better was probably George McGinnis. So there wasn't a ton of lost value there, and he was a productive player for a while. I think he's A tier. I think he is. I think he lived up to the hype to a degree, and there wasn't many guys taken after him that you could say were just far and away better, that they made a mistake by taking him. Next up is Bill Walton. Obviously, Bill Walton's one of the most hyped prospects in the history of basketball, especially at that time. Walton translated a monster career at UCLA, averaging 20.3 points, 15.7 rebounds, and 5.5 assists. And also, UCLA was 86-4 in Walton's 3 seasons. So, I mean, in general, he was pretty highly regarded as a winner and a statistical machine. And he translated that to an easy selection at number one. His major downfall, obviously, was eventually injuries. He started off his career really well, making 2 All-Star games. He won an MVP, which I touched on him in the MVP series. However, even at that time, he was still missing significant portions of the season, even when he was putting up crazy numbers with various injuries. Eventually, that all kind of caught up to him. His prime is cut extremely short, to a degree that he's kind of like the big man version of Derrick Rose, you know. He looked like a perennial dominant force, but injuries just took him out, and he could never recover from that. I will say he was a key cog later in his career in the Celtics championship win in 1986, so he did salvage that out of some of his injured years. But now he's kind of simply providing a complete masterpiece of a job as a commentator. He, talks mainly about the Grateful Dead, hears colors, tasting sounds, amongst other things. A great player, really, though, but too hurt, not long enough of a career. B tier for Bill Walton. David Thompson is up next, and one of the biggest what-ifs in NBA history. Thompson was the guy that Jordan looked up to. The guy we just discussed, Bill Walton, described Thompson as Michael Jordan, Kobe Bryant, Tracy McGrady, and LeBron James rolled into one. Maybe that is a little bit of a stretch, but he was pretty incredible. He was considered one of the best ACC players to ever play in college. Thompson went number one in both the ABA and the NBA, decided to choose the Nuggets of the ABA to play with. He only spent 1 year in the ABA before the Nuggets moved to the NBA, but that didn't slow him down at all statistically, as he was one of the best scorers in the world for about 6 seasons, averaging mostly in the high 20s the entire time. What did stop him, though, is a foot injury, and then subsequent drug addiction that's kind of sent his career spiraling. He had a few okay years after that injury, but he kind of went downhill fast. Luckily, he eventually turned his life around, but not before it was too late to make it back to the NBA. He is now a motivational speaker, which is great for him. But yeah, like I said, it's great that he turned his life around, but kind of his career in general was never quite the same. That being said, and some may question this, I think Thompson is still S tier. He had a relatively short prime, but it was long enough and good enough that he made a true impact and was one of the better players in the NBA during an era of basketball that isn't as widely regarded. But David Thompson was a great, great player, and even if his prime was relatively short, he was just an incredible player for long enough that he left an impact in basketball. Like I said, Jordan looked up to David Thompson, and he was his main role model growing up in basketball. And so he was also easily the best player from his draft. There was no one really behind him that you could say, oh, that was a better pick at number one. It was definitely still Thompson. So yeah, he is borderline S. He's almost kind of A tier, but I think he's S tier. So David Thompson, S tier. Next up is John Lucas. So John Lucas was a basketball player and a tennis player at the University of Maryland, but obviously basketball was his main thing. He was a good college player, but not anything statistically insane. He averaged 18.3 and 4.7 assists throughout his college career. He ended up going number one and was pretty consistently an average starting guard for about 12 seasons. I think usually that would justify B tier, but he missed a good number of games with injury, so he never really played full seasons. And there was a lot of good guys in his draft, like Adrian Dantley, Alex English, Dennis Johnson, Robert Parrish, all were drafted behind him. And I think that looking back, drafting him would have been considered a pretty big letdown. So C tier for John Lucas. So next up is Kent Benson. So Kent Benson was a great high school player. He won Indiana Mr. Basketball for Newcastle Chrysler High School, and then went on to be a key member of the legendary Indiana University teams of the 70s, and the last undefeated team in college basketball alongside Quinn Buckner and Scott May. All three of them got drafted really high, but the highest was Benson, who went number one overall in 1977. What you could kind of tell from the careers of those three guys, it seems like maybe the IU system at the time kind of helped boost his production, just the way that that team worked and how cohesive they were, because none of those three were quite good in the NBA, and like I said, Benson was no exception, because when he hit the league, again, he was pretty good, but he never approached his college production. If you look at the guys drafted right after him, there's about 5 All-Stars and 2 Hall of Famers in the draft, in the draft's top 10 even, including Bernard King, Jack Sikma. Benson is not one of them, so he's going to be C tier as well. So next up, Michael Thompson. So interesting story. He grew up in the Bahamas, played pickup ball to learn the game. Eventually, he got good enough that he decided to move to Miami and play at a higher level. So joined a team called Miami Jackson that had 3 people from the Bahamas and a Cuban starting, and they just completely dominated, winning every game, going 33-0, winning by an average of 30 points. They won the title with 4 ineligible players, including Thompson, due to falsified birth records. But that kind of in the past. He moved on to college, had a great career from Minnesota, and then into the NBA. He had a 12-year career as a really good starting level player. He is a borderline A tier, but he didn't give quite what you want from a number 1 pick type guy, as he was never an all-star. A very good player, but never an all-star. His son Clay would be A tier if he was drafted here. But Michael is going to be B. So next up, Magic Johnson. So this one doesn't have to be that difficult. Magic Johnson was an incredible college player, winning a championship with Michigan State over Indiana State in 1979 versus Larry Bird. Considered to be one of the most hyped up championship games of all time. That was a really good preview into their great rivalry for their careers. Magic then, after that, moved into the NBA, drafted as a member of the Lakers. Ended up as a 5-time champion, 3-time MVP, Finals MVP, 12-time All-Star, almost unanimously considered to be the best point guard ever to this day, with only 1 or 2 players even having an argument. Magic Johnson's S tier. I don't feel like it needs that much justification. Great player. Finally, for this list, we have Barry Carroll. So, a name that not many know when it comes to players from back in the day, and he was definitely overshadowed by Kevin McHale, who went 2 picks after. He was still really a pretty good player in his prime. He played for Purdue in college, was considered to be a really highly talented player. He averaged 22 and 9 as a senior in college, and moving into the league, he had about 6 seasons averaging 20 and 8. The problem with Barry Carroll is that he did have a solid career. He was still considered a disappointment by a lot of people. He got a nickname during his career called, basically people called him Joe Barely Cares, due to his perceived lack of effort on the court. Many claim that he wasted his talent and could have been much better than what he was. He just kind of appeared as though he was lazy playing. And so whether that's fair or not, usually his stats would probably garner an A, especially considered his best years. But due to the fact that generally he is considered a major disappointment, I really can't put him any higher than B. Um, just as to say that he played as he was a pretty decent player, but just everyone when you talk about Joe Barry Carroll, when you look into what people said, they just don't have a lot of great things to say about the way he played in his career and if he lived up into that number one overall selection. Um, but that is it when it comes to this video. So, hope you guys enjoyed this one. I got a few more to go in this series. When it comes to future video series, if you guys have any ideas, go ahead and put those in the comment section. I always want to consider new ideas, try to keep this thing going as much as possible. But yeah, if you enjoyed this one, go ahead, like and subscribe. There's plenty more tier lists to come from this. But yeah, with that being said, hope you guys enjoyed this one.